Well, and I'm the director of the Cambridge Endowment for Research in Finance, which is providing you with, or helping provide you with food and drink and general sustenance around this event, as well as offsetting some other expenses. And I think that we made a good investment in the sense that I certainly enjoyed the discussion today. And we're now going to have a discussion arising out of the issues. I'd like to introduce the discussion by trying to identify some themes which we've heard today. But I want to start with a text. I think we ought to have, sort of like a sermon, we ought to have a text. And the text comes from Alan Greenspan's evidence before the US House of Representatives last October, where Alan Greenspan said, "In the last few months, the entire intellectual edifice of risk management, which we have used for the last few decades, has collapsed." The entire intellectual edifice has collapsed. Now, whether that Greenspan's text resonated in this seminar is, I think, a matter for debate, and a matter for, it will be interesting to hear both from the panel members and from the audience your reaction to the notion that something has entirely collapsed. Now, themes. What themes were there? Well, one of the concepts, I would say peculiar concepts, one of the concepts which resonated in all the discussions was the fundamentals. Hashim said there weren't any, or at least they couldn't be identified satisfactorily. Dr. Musiela had said that felt that there would be a return to normal in due course, but he wasn't quite sure, but also referred to the fundamentals. Dr. Vives referred to the fundamentals and fundamental pricing on several occasions, as if there were fundamentals. So one of the issues that is knocking around in this discussion is there an anchor, such a thing called fundamentals? And if so, what are they? Are they determined in a real economy? Or where are they determined? Another issue, and going side by side with that, was the proposal that externalities could be dealt with by taxes and benefits, a sort of completion of market story, taxes and subsidies, which it seems to me is a completion market story which goes side by side with the notion that the market can generate something called fundamentals. There was, however, in Hashim's denial of the existence of fundamentals, an interesting assertion. And the assertion was that the model which generated fundamentals, whilst it had no relation to the real world, was nonetheless useful because we could discuss the real world as deviations from that model. I remember, I think this proposition has been made in this university before. Frank Hahn famously made the proposition that the contribution of general equilibrium theory to economic understanding was the same as the contribution of flatness to mountaineering. There is a relationship. Okay, so that was one. There's this notion about the fundamentals and the models which may or may not generate fundamentals, which was, I think, a ghost in either a ghost or explicitly confronted in all of the talks. Secondly, there was the proposition which was brought out, particularly in Dr. Farmer's talk, the last one, that efforts to manage risk can create risk. And I think this was an enormously important proposition. I mean, if we look at the great Basel trilogy, the great thematic trilogy which has underlined the proposals of the Basel committees, the trilogy has been more transparency, more disclosure, and more efficient risk management by firms. And those three things will reduce risk. Those three things will make actions more homogeneous and will increase risk in the face of extreme events. So the notion that actually the proposals, both by individual agents or by regulators, to manage risk may actually increase risk, I think is an enormously important proposition. And it should be something which I hope we can address. And finally, the the issue which was not mentioned, I mean, the dog that didn't bark at this particular seminar, was there's been no discussion of macroeconomics. Everything has been portrayed as the interaction of individual agents and the way in which a sort of general equilibrium solution of individual agents can be resolved or not resolved. And this is rather contrary to the current fashion in the reaction to the crisis, because the fashion in regulatory circles is to discuss something called macroprudential regulation, which is that various regulatory rules or charges should be based on the performance of the macroeconomy, not on the performance of individual firms. Now that is a proposition which runs all the way through the Turner report, it runs through La Rosière, it runs through all the main reports which are now knocking around, which will be informing both what is being done in the United States and the white paper which the British government is due to publish in the next couple of weeks on regulation. Now, the basic argument is that the externalities generated in financial markets are transmitted macroeconomically through the general state of confidence, the general rate of interest, the exchange rate, and cannot satisfactorily be characterized as inter-individual transactions, even with complete markets. So that's the sort of dog that didn't bark, it seemed to me, in this particular discussion. However, it is not for me to speak, although I've taken the chairman's license. It is for me to be the chairman. It just seemed to me that the issue of fundamentals, the issue of the management of risk, creating risk, the Greenspan quote, "Has the whole intellectual edifice collapsed?" These, it seems, are some themes we might take up. I wonder if we could start on the fundamentals. Bill.
I'm happy to, because I live in the world of the fundamentals in my 35-year sojourn from Cambridge by way of the world of venture capital and entrepreneurial finance and back to Cambridge. John, my response, I think, is you really made 2 points there. One is the fundamentals, and the other is the macro implications of what we might call the new micro foundation of economics and finance. I think Doyne did make the point that the DSGE models are hopeless, that they absolutely exclude from consideration any of what is coming out of the world of banking, of financial systems, financial markets. And there, I think, we can, with some degree of confidence, expect, in the spirit of Hashem's work particularly, the working out of the macro implications of these kinds of micro foundations of limited information, endogenous herding by agents who we might as well consider to be rational. They're doing the best they can with the limited tools they have. But I think there's another aspect here that is, in a way, I guess this is a fundamentally contrarian point. We're all very concerned now about macroprudential regulation. And there's a very large baby swimming in this bathtub. The notion here is that we worry far too much about efficiency. And in a capitalist economic system driven through time by technological innovation, one actually could argue that that waste is the virtue. The ability to afford evolutionary processes, trial and error and error and error, in order to wind up with a more productive and higher real income economy, so that the new macro financial economics will incorporate the notion of bubbles and crashes as being endogenous phenomena. But those bubbles and crashes are absolutely what is necessary to accommodate the waves of technological innovation that require massive amounts of capital to be thrown at building networks of railways and fiber and electrification grids before you know what you're going to do with them. And equally massive amounts of capital to be thrown at the hopeful monsters, only a very few of which will turn into Amazon and Google, and most of which will disappear not without a trace. They will disappear, leaving the trace of very substantial losses on the parts of the investors. So smoothing it all out, flattening the system, could be a way to create the economics of the Chinese empire of the 17th century, which notoriously refused to exploit the innovations that the great Joseph Needham documented so extensively.
Actually, fundamentals?
Well, I think maybe I should clarify. I didn't say in a stationary world the fundamentals do not exist. In fact, I did amplify that if the world we lived in were stationary and people would learn, they also would have the fundamentals. My problem is that actually maybe related to what Vives was saying, that I've already said in other contexts, that the technological innovation, by very nature of it, is unpredictable. And we need more technological innovation to prosper. And because of that, the world is not a stationary. I mean, that's my opinion. And because it's not a stationary, in fact, it's good that it's not a stationary. I think if the world were a stationary, we would, we would have our strategies. We would press a button, that strategy would work itself out. We would be just a machine. So I think, in a way, my argument is not negative. My argument is to be realistic. My argument is to realize that these models that you build on the basis of a stationary assumption and ergodicity is going to disappoint you. I mean, this is my point. My point is not that we shouldn't be doing these things. I spent, God knows, long enough of my life developing models, as you know. As we speak, we have this global model, which we do take into account all these financial and macro areas, sometimes supported by your own unit, as you know. So basically, and everybody is actually developing a structure of the world economy in which it's interrelated, and how we just realized just recently that how the exchange rate, because there is one exchange rate less, that creates a common factor in the world which cannot diversify against. Just simply because you have an exchange rate, basically. It doesn't matter who the exchange rate, whether the is the US or something. So I was trying to explain that my argument was that the world is not stationary. Because of technological innovation, because of the nature of institutions, which is a part of technology. The way I look at it, institutions are part of technology. Regulation is like a technology. Derivatives is like a technology, in my language, in an abstract language. Because of that, we need to be modest. We need to understand. So I had a conversation at the tea break. I was asking, I think the problem is we should put, less zero probability event in our system. In other words, what we do, because we want our life simple, we know that the world is very complex and interrelated. So what we do, because we are human beings and we want to have a solution, we basically partition the world we live in into two bits, the bit that we can handle and the bit we cannot handle. Then we put zero probability event on all the other bits. And that often becomes the huge part of the system. We carry on with the bit we can handle. We suddenly become surprised by it. The question is that we should start realizing that there are events out there that could affect our calculation that we are ruling out at the moment. At least allow for it. I'm just pleading. I'm not suggesting that.
Just to about the fundamentals, let me state the law, Your Honor. Let me be bold and predict where will the stock market be in 100 years. Well, it will be where the fundamentals are. That's to say, approximately, if you want to predict where the stock market will be in 100 years, just take the rate of growth, if you know it, obviously, the rate of growth, which we can have some idea, no? The rate of growth over this period, and then you get it very, very close. In fact, if you go back, typically in very long haul periods,
The economy.
of the economy, the rate of growth of the economy. The rate of growth of the US economy gets very currently where the Dow Jones is. Okay, so over the very long haul.
How do you know what the rate of growth of the next time?
I don't know, well, but that's another thing. No, but these are the fundamentals. Wait. These are the fundamentals.
This is exactly
What
my
are the
point. You do not know.
No. We asked where the fundamentals exist. Yes, the fundamentals exist. No, the fundamentals exist. The real economy exists. It grows. And that's it. So these are the fundamentals.
There may
Well,
be,
fundamentals are-
there may be, in that time, a zero probability scenario that will actually materialize, and exactly in 100 years from today, we will have another economic crash. And the stock market will lose 50, 60, 70% of value.
It's also years.
Let me ask you first.
Number two comment, just to complete the discussion on the subject. What we discussed over the tea break was, my point was, I agree with the fact that we have a tendency to allocate zero probability to certain possible scenarios. But I disagree on the concept that we are able to identify them all and choose those to which we give positive probability and say the rest of it has zero probability and have faith that we have identified 100% the support of the distribution on which we want to place. I don't think we could foresee what actually happened in credit market when the stable relationship, the basis between CDS and bonds broke down. I don't think we could, even a month ahead, know that this is going to happen. And I don't know if it was obvious to everybody that the stable relationship between OIS and LIBOR would break exactly at that point in time, and what would be the consequences. And those would be the scenario on which rationally we would, in the past, put zero probability. But would we know that these are the ones that we should worry about?
No, but you know, one way to think about this is that the fundamental may, at any particular point in time, be very, very difficult to identify, if at all. And I tend to agree with Hashem. But there can be such deviations from what, over any period of time, has been a fundamental, that, like pornography, you want to know it when you see it, which isn't enough. So in 1997, two great investors both knew that there was a deviation from any kind of stable equilibrium taking place in the NASDAQ market. One was Warren Buffett, and he could afford to be wrong for as long as he cared because he has a permanent funding base. He could just sell his stock. The other was Julian Robertson, who had a hedge fund, and while his record was so great that his investors gave him an extra year, before the bubble burst, they took all his money away. Both were absolutely correct that this bubble was going to burst. One could afford to be wrong long enough to benefit from it, and the other was put out of business. And I think that's a dynamic in these markets that is very important. And it was certainly predictable that the bubble was going to burst.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Just one comment. I would like to be very optimistic about fundamentals that seem to work. In the area of valuation by the concept of replication, I think this is a very narrow area in finance, and this is even a narrower area in economy at large. The notion of being able to understand the relationship between value and the hedge is something which I think, as a law, is fundamentally right, if correctly understood, that it will probably withstand the test of time. And this is where I see one of the greatest discoveries, scientific discoveries, that took place in finance. This is one of these things that is much, much easier than very strong scientific understanding of investment problems, because this is much, much more complex. The notion of linking, at the end of the day, we say simply the following. We have a surface that represents the price as a function of certain variables that affect it. And we do some kind of Taylor expansion of it, and given where we are in a space and time, we try to manage the risk. Now, of course, when markets are very regular, local sensitivity makes sense. When they are very chaotic, it breaks down. But it did break down before as well, when we priced discontinuous payoffs and we were at the money on a large notional and the delta was moving, and it didn't work. So there is limits to which certain methodologies work, and if understood correctly, those limits, then I think they are quite valid fundamentals that we have achieved in pricing.
I just like that Dr. Farmer and Dr. Vives is straining the leash on my left here, but I let Dr. Palmer have the word. Then I'll let you ask any questions on fundamentals, and then we'll continue. Right, Dr. Farmer.
So I think I broadly agree with most of the panelists here. The problem with fundamentals is that is not that they don't exist, but what are they? I mean, I can bracket the price of Microsoft. I know the company's worth more than $1,000, and it's worth less than $1 trillion, and I'm confident of that. But what is it really worth?
That's good.
What is it really worth? I don't know. I mean, Fisher Black had a maximum that prices are typically within about a factor of 2 of the fundamentals. And I think that's probably most of the time that's about right. Where the fundamental really means a distribution of prices with a mean somewhere, but the problem is we don't really know what the mean. And that's, after all, why we're even here talking about this stuff, because we're all in the business in various ways of debating what those fundamentals are and making our own bets about what they are, and through those bets actually setting the prices that at any given moment are probably our best guess about, collective guess about where those fundamentals are. But do we collectively guess right? No. I mean, I think we're off, like Fisher Black said, typically by a factor of 2 or so, and sometimes worse. So, I mean, I just think we have to always have the humility to remember that and keep that in the background. I wanted to amplify a little bit on your point about bubbles and crashes, which I think is a fascinating one. Are bubbles and crashes inevitable, or should we try and amp them out? It goes back to the question, are the fundamentals, fundamentally oscillating or not? It's not clear to me the fundamentals are oscillating, but the prices sure are. And Bill may have a good point that we actually need bubbles and crashes to get reasonable levels of long-range growth. There are lots of control systems, lots of chemical oscillators, things like this, where having cycles is inherent to improving the efficiency of what's going on. I think, though, I think that's a nice point, and I tend to believe it at the same time, that are the bubbles and crashes that we're going through optimal?
No.
I really doubt it. And could we do better if we understood this better? I think we could. And I think we've already seen it, even the recent tech bubble, where, okay, on one hand we had a tech bubble, but on the other hand there was an awful lot of forewarning that was happening, it was publicly debated. I think it damped what the bubble did. And you also see it on a personal level, and in 1999, any fool with any crazy idea could get venture capitalists all over them to get it funded, and in 2001, really great ideas were going begging. And I don't think that's efficient for the economy. So I think we could do it better. But we may have to accept that we actually have to have bubbles and crashes, even if they don't exist in the, quote, elusive real fundamentals, wherever God actually puts them.
So, are there any points people would like to raise in response to the discussion? So, yes, there are. Right.
I'd like to point out that, in some sense, bubbles and crashes are as inevitable as capitalism itself, right? Karl Marx in the 19th century pointed out that the crisis of overproduction is indeed it's a birthmark of capitalism, right? And now with all this on-demand production and so on and so forth, it's extremely difficult to overproduce television sets. But yet capitalism, certainly with its creative power, did find a way of overproducing. It overproduced houses, which are not needed, and completely mispriced, etc., etc., etc. So that's one position. So basically, in essence, what we need to decide is whether or not we want to have capitalist economy or say socialist economy or whatnot. And from personal experience, I can tell you I tried both, and I would say we should stick with capitalism. On the other hand, I would like to point out that this idea of having improbable scenarios to which we kind of assign positive and zero probability, etc., it's also as innate as the human nature itself. And in this respect, I cannot help but quote, the famous book by this Czech author Hrabal, which is called "I Serve the King of England," where the kind of repeating motif is, and the impossible came true. And it happens all over the place. So from that perspective, I think that the kind of deviation between LIBOR and OIC from 20 basis points to 100 basis points barely merits this kind of description of impossible coming true. But some other things Probably yes. But at the same time, this crisis which we have been observing, as it was indicated, is possibly a crisis related to over leverage of the system. I doubt it very much, because in actual fact, when the whole thing was built, so to speak, this whole bubble, the leverage was thought to be very, very small. In actual fact, zero, because people were thinking that they're gorging on paper which was AAA rated, which for all practical purposes means that it's kind of as good as gold, so to speak, right? So from that perspective, I think that my position is that impossible comes for sure, and it happens all the time. And then, overproduction is inevitable, and we have to live with it. We can regulate it a little bit, of course, improve the system. It's always a commendable kind of undertaking, but it cannot be eliminated unless the system itself is dramatically changed.
Okay, let's take a series of comments. I'm over here, yes.
Yeah, the thing is, at first when this crisis happened, I saw the LIBOR spread from the OIS. I was shocked. I didn't think it happened until somebody pointed me out the history. And the thing is, this has happened over and over again. The first time I'm aware of is 1830. In 1830, the big thing happening was U.S. was opening up the Midwest to farming. Farmers are net cash consumers for the first 5 years. People are loaning them money in New York. The bonds are then these loans are then being syndicated and sold on to Europe. They're making so much money off syndicating loans that pretty soon they didn't care about the quality of the loans, because they're making the money off syndicating them. And of course, inevitable happened. There was a drought one year. The farmers suddenly fell behind, couldn't make the loan payments, and suddenly there's this huge cash squeeze in Europe, right, where everything fell apart. And I think, boy, this happened there. Some economic historians said the same thing happened in I think it was the 70s with the railroads in South America, et cetera, et cetera. There's an exciting idea. There's a new financial instrument. People overproduced on it. They were making so much money that they lost their shirts, right? And it's exactly what happened.
Are you
it's not-
suggesting that we don't have learning capacity?
Short
memory?
Better than suggesting that this time it's different.
Yeah. No. This time is not different. The problem with regulation, as Alex knows, is as soon as you get regulation, you get hire smart people like him, and you figure out ways around the regulation, right? It just happens. And as long as the regulators have a finite set of rules, there'll be a way around them.
That's the basis of the principles versus rules debate. Yes.
Exactly.
I just would like to make a comment about the quote from Gridspan and about the model. And I wonder if the valuation by replication that we mentioned before has not been victim of its success, in the sense that, it became a massive calibration exercise. And when everything is fine, well, you get all information from the market. But my background is more credit risk. And then it's not liquid, you don't have anything tradable, and you cannot look at this. And another thing which is very important, and I think in terms of this methodology I'm not very good at, is to look at correlation. And that's one of the main issue, because a lot of the people started with the same option pricing to look, for example, at CDO or CDO square. And to be honest, people have no clue about the correlation. So how can you get a price? And I think there was this nice painting about the blind leading the blind. And I think that's exactly that. And the other things, should we have one price? We saw a lot of institutions piling up, for example, in property. Well, if you had a model and pricing with respect to their own book, taking into account correlation, well, things will be different. So I think there is a lot of issue about using a model which works perfectly well in one environment and to try to apply this, because it's true, it's a great model, looks very nice, very sexy, mathematically, but it doesn't apply everywhere. And I think starting from a portfolio perspective and looking at correlation, because that's one thing which I think has changed in terms of the comment which was made before, is there's more and more information and communication, and we said it's increasing the risk because the correlation is increasing. And that's something, and it changes over time. And I think that's something we need really to develop and to look more, is to look at this correlation, how the correlation is changing over time, and try to take this into account in terms of how we value the book, how we take this into account, and for example, take into account not only the P&L, but the balance sheet and the capital management. And I think that's one thing which is really missing.
Thank you. I'll just take two more comments, and then we'll get the panel with Terry.
Terry Barker from Land Economy. talking about fundamentals, I think it's a bit misleading term because I think the fundamentals you're talking about are institutional responses to in the framework of a whole lot of laws and regulations which are governing these markets. And one of those is that companies that take risks and then essentially go insolvent. And the rule of capitalism here is that those do go insolvent and that something is done rather than them getting enormous loans and bailouts. So my question is really, because what we've seen is that the large banks have survived this crisis, despite the fact that they would have, if left to the market, they would have gone bust. And this seems to me has changed that particular fundamental. Because other firms could equally go to governments and say, well, they're equally essential. Why can't they be saved? Why are they too big to fail? So my question really is, what does the panel regard about the question of banks being too big to fail? And doesn't this undermine capitalism itself and the very fundamentals?
Okay, thanks. I'll take one. Is there one more, and then we'll turn to the panel? Yes. Sorry.
Well, I really enjoyed the chairman's summary. It's more of a summary than an introduction. And I suspect we won't get much past it. But if I'd known he thought that, I would have gone to more of his lectures in the last half century. I think it's interesting. Well, a number of issues are very interesting. What's all this problem about asset valuation? After all, estate agents do it, auctioneers do it, even bookmakers do it. It's only a problem when you're dependent on a model which cannot forecast returns and cannot estimate risk. That intrigues me, that the panel resort in answering the questions to talking like laymen. They don't explain how their models have elucidated an understanding of the situation. And one last point. Under your nose, we're about to solve this recession and collapse by another bubble. It's in train already. It's expected to replace the railroad, the IT revolution, and that's the carbon control bubble.
Thank you very much. We've had a whole series of points on various parts of the territory, but I know that Dr. Vives was straining at the leash to comment, so perhaps he can lead off and then others follow.
Okay. So going back, staying in the fundamentals, I wanted to add something which is also tangential to what has been commented so far. Take the Spanish housing market. Spanish housing market has gone up tremendously, dramatically, like in other places, I believe. Some people somehow believe that this was a bubble and that the fundamentals, whatever they are, were way below the prices of the Spanish houses. How did they get to this conclusion? Well, by looking at demand and supply, and reasonable projections on demand and supply over a certain period. Basically, the income that people have, what they can pay, the rental, kind of reasonable growth prospects on employment, etc. And some people, what did they do? Even if they got to the conclusion that this was a bubble, what did they do? Did they got out immediately of the property market in Spain? No. They kind of timed the exit of this bubble. Some people did it successfully. Basically, in 2006, let's say, they went out. Some others probably they went over. They took too much risk. So basically, they evaluated the situation, and they, through kind of some calculation, they responded. I think many agents have tried, kind of to ride the bubble in this way. And some people, then have been more successful. Some others have been less successful. But all this is based on what? Well, based on a calculation of what are the underlying values there in this market, and in this category belongs to. This is one thing. Then on the, well, just maybe two little comments on the different issues which have been raised. One on the importance of correlation, and in particular the increased correlation which happens in crisis episodes. Here I think definitely what we have to learn a lot and rethink is regulation. For example, basal pillars that have been mentioned before, capital requirements, and how some of the regulations in place, in fact, have been too procyclical, and that's why we think that this may out in a negative direction, and therefore how capital requirements and regulation can think through this, and make this smoother, this procyclicality smoother, and take into account systemic components of the risk. And how you do this? Well, I think we are thinking through exactly how to do this, but also this links then with the other issue which has been raised, which is on bailouts and too big to fail. What to do with that? Well, obviously, an institution that thinks it's too big to fail will have incentives to take too much risk, and I'm sure that big banks have had this tendency in the subprime movement, because they thought, if this scenario happens, in any case, we will bail out, right? Okay, so this happened, in fact, and they have been bailed out, so they were right, perfectly rational, by the way. What to do with that? Well, I think the consequence of that is that regulation has to be stepped up. So if you are systemic, you have to have some obligations so that you internalize the externalities that you produce to the system. And this may be with higher capital requirement, liquidity ratios, I don't know. We have to think through exactly the less damaging way to do it, but I don't see other way.
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to relate this issue of market mechanism, market efficiency, and the fundamentals. I mean, I didn't have time to present another part of the slide, which was what I call market efficiency hypothesis revisited, and I think actually is central to some of this discussion. The reason is that you don't need to know the fundamentals to have a market which works reasonably well. Type of argument you probably implicitly suggested. Your example of that there are a lot of estate agents, we ourselves are evaluating our thing based on the best we can do, as was pointed out. I think this is absolutely true. But let's just now tell you what happens. Now what happens is this, that you have this market efficiency argument, and let's take each individual. For each individual, you will have expected excess return on whatever asset they are arbitraging. Doesn't matter, you can apply to any pair of assets on any number of them, this argument. That expected excess return meaning you define a strategy effectively for a particular strategy, is equal to the personal value of risk premium plus the cost of transaction. Because there are always costs of transaction, market impact, fees, and buying a house, you have to have that. Now, what happens is this, I would distribute my slides, you can see it there. What happens is this, that imagine you have got millions of individuals like that. Each of them decide, based on their subjective view of the world they live in, whatever evaluation they're doing, and equate that expected return on that strategy, whatever that strategy is, equal to this premium and the cost. Now, then aggregate it, right? Just do average, because the market averages, not individual, it's not either. When you average it, if you make the assumption of rational expectation, that's the key. If you can make the assumption of rational expectation, what it does, it makes sure that the expected of the risk premium plus the cost has to be equal across every agent. It imposes a fundamental discipline, right? I'm sure that Chris knows this because he's written the model and it actually becomes that. You don't need a model to do it. You immediately get that because of the law of iterated expectation. If you condition on a common information, all the difference of information disappears. Eventually you get this equilibrium, which basically like the world is the average. That's perfectly all right. Now wait the following scenario. Now imagine the rational expression didn't exist in that world, right? It wasn't valid. So you are making some mistake because you can't just say because the estate agent went and did evaluation didn't make a mistake. You just say they did it. You didn't evaluate whether that was right or not. Imagine you make some mistakes, somebody else some makes another mistake, and all these mistakes then would average. Again, if there were not correlation, now that's related to your correlation problem. If there were no correlation across these mistakes, in fact, you need some kind of weak correlation. You don't need lack of correlation. That's the beauty of it. If you make cross-section weakly, what I call weakly dependent, that I don't want to go into that, then again this washes out. The problem arises is when these correlations suddenly, because of non-linearity, complexity of the system, go up and become correlated strongly. Then the market would not work. It doesn't matter what individuals do, whether it's because of the herding, whatever is the reason, I don't care, because the herding argument is just put a facade on this point. It says that it happens through this mechanism. It could happen through another mechanism. If there are individuals have correlated in a strong way, markets would not work. Democracies would not work. Nothing would work, because the whole of the basis of decentralized system, and Hayek point with somebody related, is that individuals are independent. And they arrive at their conclusion totally independent of each other, so that maybe there's some little correlation across them, but so long as that not correlation is strong, the averages play magic. It's best thing. Everybody knows it's become sufficient statistics. The problem is we don't know that these averages actually are based on components which are weakly dependent. We don't know. They suddenly become strongly dependent. You get a crash. I don't think anybody can solve this problem.
I think this is so important. I mean, I think
It's
to
on
me,
my slide, by the way. The proof is on my slide.
to me, the real failure of the application, not of Merton models and Black-Scholes, the real failure of the application of them was the reification of the statistical attributes of the time series of prices. Liquidity, volatility, correlation were abstracted from the processes that generated the time series of prices. And it was not recognized until the world enforced it, that in fact, those statistical attributes are time varying, contingent on the state of markets, on the degree of correlation of behavior. And that was, those who were sensitive to that, like Jamie Dimon, who had this phrase when he got to JP Morgan of having a fortress balance sheet, and who incidentally did not drive the people who invented credit derivatives into creating a securitization machine, and on the contrary, allowed them to back off from the consequences of their creation, versus Citibank. So there also, it does, one of the, I think, encouraging aspects of the last 18 to 24 months is that we can actually see differing behavior among different agents who were operating in the same domain with the same incentive structure, and some of whom said, you know what, this is nuts. We're not playing. And others of whom, like Chuck Prince, had to step on the accelerator as they were approaching the edge of the cliff.
Oh, it's interesting, by the way, a comment on climate change and trading carbon and so on. The woman who created the derivatives, credit derivatives team at JP Morgan in the mid-1990s is now in charge of their carbon trading division.
Global commodities, all commodities.
I think I wanted to stress something you said about taking a systemic view. I mean, systemic risk is the underlying thing that got us here, not kind of individual risk. It's all the pieces out there in the system doing something that we collectively were not fully conscious of, and which is part of why I think the complex systems view of what's going on, which Hashim stressed in his talk, is so important. We have to understand how all these interacting pieces, what they can collectively create. And I think, it's key that we recognize that in a globalized world that we really have to think globally, because the economies of the world are so connected, and we're in a unique historical situation where the economy is ultimately driving the whole world global ecology. I mean, whether or not, how much global warming we get is critically dependent on what the world economy does between now and then. And I guess, you know, I think we have to remember, the way I look at it, the world now is a garden. It's not a wilderness anymore. I mean, that's true from an ecological point of view. What's happening in Brazil is strongly affected by, you know, our discussions today, or certainly what Larry Summers decides to do. So the question is, how do we collect?
Rather the second.
No. But I mean, how do we collectively manage this kind of thing? And I think on one hand, we need to think about getting the right set of low-level rules that incentivize distributed information processing, that create the correct kind of incentives, that decouple and distribute risks, and that allow for monitoring. You know, I think it's critical that things be traded on exchanges so that we can actually know what's out there, and which leads into the second thing, that at the same time, though I think we have to exercise a certain amount of high-level control in a Keynesian style. I think we want to minimize how much we have to do that, but I do think we have to do it, and then we have to understand what the right way to do that is. And I think it's important that economics as a subject be focused on the cause and effect of these relationships and the need to actually make serious predictions about what to do.
Well, that really leads on, actually, to the second broad theme that I tried to suggest, which you actually mentioned yourself, which was that efforts to manage risk can create risk. And that links also with Greenspan's comment that the entire edifice of risk, intellectual edifice of risk management has collapsed. I wonder if panel members would like to comment on these propositions.
Because it also goes over to where you were beginning and talking about the macro implications, the lack of discussion, extensive discussion. I had a very interesting experience this past Friday at Wharton with a collaborator of Hashem's, who's named Till Sherman, who's in a very interesting position. At the New York Fed, he's the fellow who ran the stress tests. And with respect to transforming the intellectual context in which the micro-financial is related to the macroeconomic, as he laid out what they actually did, it served two purposes. One, it was in effect a reverse engineering exercise that completely, in effect, discredits the practical utility of DSGE models. I'll explain this in a second. And second, it explained why the response of the markets to the stress tests, contrary to almost all external observers, has in fact been extremely positive. So all they did, all that the authorities did to the 19 banks, was give them three numbers. They gave them a time path of three numbers, macroeconomic numbers: GDP growth, unemployment, and house prices, average house prices. Yeah. Well, not fundamental prices. They just gave them a forecast. They gave them a base case. They gave them a base case, which was not the Fed's base case. It was the three different sets of mainstream forecasters. And then they gave them an adverse case, which was substantially worse than that. And then they required the banks to take those externals and drive them through their balance sheets. And then they started arguing. But what they came out of the argument was forecast bank by bank for the cumulative 2-year actual realized loss on the credit portfolio. They had a separate exercise for the market portfolio, which actually had by and large been mark to market. It was much less of an issue. And they got on average, for the across the 19, they got to 9.1% actual cash loss on the credit portfolios. And it turns out that the worst 2-year cumulative loss of the US banking system in the Great Depression was less than 9.1%. And when they released that number to the market, the TED spread dropped like a stone. And it gave them a number, which they also argued about how much capital needed to be put in the event of a 9.1 to deal with the consequences of that process. I was enormously impressed, in fact, with the integrity and the intelligence of the manner in which the stress tests, A, were conducted, and then B, were communicated.
Actually, I just wanted to say is that obviously we need to have more contractual models for this kind of purposes. I mean, I think I would not favor blank regulations. That you
Louder.
I don't favor a blank regulation. By blank, I mean a rule-based regulation, in the sense that you say, oh, you have to have this, you have to have that. Because these are often regulation for the past crisis, not the future crisis may come. Because it's not forward-looking in character. What you really need, that's why when I worked with Till Sherman, he was in private sector before he went to the Federal Reserve Bank. But the question we were asked, I was helping with a bank in Germany, one of Scandinavia. Now, the question they asked us was, he was in Oliver Wyman, I was consulting there. The question was that if there was a catastrophe happens, an economic catastrophe happens, like in Far East Asia, what happens to the portfolio, the risk of the portfolio that bank had? Right? When I tried to answer that question, I realized that you not only need to know what's happening in Germany, but you need to know what's happening in Germany vis-a-vis the rest of the world, because either the bank lends directly to the rest of the world, so therefore it's exposed because it's a lend to, say, Far East Asia, or it's lent to a company in Germany which trades with Far East Asia. Right? So both through actual direct capital flows and trade consideration, you need interconnected system. You can't just rely on a simple, since we are bashing DLG, let me add to it, a simple DLG model, which basically have three variables in it. The model is closed economy, and are deviation from deterministic trend, and they are worried about the wiggles around the fundamental, which they don't know what it is. Now, it just seems to me we have lost an opportunity for the last 30 years. That's my view. And therefore, you need more complex system. I don't mean complex in a sense that maybe only the physicists talk about. I mean in terms of maybe a large systems that economics require. We talk about world is interrelated. We talk about flow of technology and information. What does it mean? It means that you need interconnected system to look at risk. You just can't just shut off a part of your system. That is my conclusion. If you really want to move forward, you need to put there to your hands. You become real scientists and work with complicated structures. It needs to be simplified and try to do counterfactual of the type that we're talking about. So create some idea of where the bounds of risk is, and then have moral suasion or some other method to avert problems.
Actually,
That's my view on that.
Dr. Vives is again straining at the leash, but I'm going to again go to the audience, give them a chance. Just one comment, of course. We now know that the Financial Services Authority ran the stress test on the British banking system in 2004 and predicted exactly the Northern Rock crisis and what the consequences would be. And then the Treasury, the bank, and the FSA did nothing. So you also have a sort of political stroke institutional issue to deal with. Okay, so before we go back to the panel again, I wonder if anybody here wants to comment on has risk management created more risks? Or similar question, or other questions you want to raise. I don't want to be too prescriptive. Sorry, you haven't participated yet.
I was going to ask a question, presumably of Professor Farmer, about precisely that. You talked about complex physical systems, and you did mention once, and it's the only time it's been mentioned, is control systems. Now, it is very easy for anybody who's used to engineering systems, which are of course all prescribed because they obey completely rational systems. But it's very easy when you decide on applying a control system that you can make things worse. And those of us who are used to talking about stability theory and so on will know exactly what is proposed. And I'm surprised that nobody, although you talk about time series, nobody has talked about time scales, the differing scales over which different phenomena show up. So I'm really asking a question of Professor Farmer.
We'll come back to it. I just want to take up some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
And you raised the question about the quote from, was it Greenspan, saying the entire intellectual edifice of risk management is collapsed. I think, personally, I think that goes far too far. I mean, I think that there's a whole range of control systems, hedging systems, and so on, which a lot of people have agonized about, continuing to agonize about, and whilst in many respects they were proved imperfect, I think that to say that completely collapsed just goes far, far too far. But what I'd be interested in the panel's comments on is, I think there's one particular area which was crucial in the credit crunch, and that is in the area of derivatives, where a lot of banks, a lot of organisations completely outsourced their risk management to ratings agencies and just relied on what the ratings agencies came up with, which had all sorts of issues, all sorts of conflict issues, all sorts of inaccuracy issues, and that particular area, I think, that Greenspan's comments are true about, and I'd be interested in the panel's comments on that.
Thanks. David?
Let's suppose that you do the stress test, as happened in 2004, and you identify Northern Rock as a potentially failing bank, and then you do something. And presumably the question is, does the something you do cause everybody in the market to immediately assume that this is indeed a failing bank, and just precipitates the problem? In other words, how do you actually intervene when you identify the problem without making it worse? How do you prick a bubble which might go away?
How do you take the punch bowl away? Yes, so questions in the back of Michael.
John mentioned bad behavior of government, and previous David did as well. What about private bad behavior? I think an interesting thing that happened in the first quarter of this year is the fact that the top 3 insurance companies in the U.S. lost $36 billion on their hedges for guaranteed investment products, guaranteed annuities. Now, why? Because they took out extensive hedging programs with the leading investment banks, fixed for floating swaps, fixed rate stayed high, floating rate went to 0, and they lost $36 billion. Now, perhaps that's just a failure of hedging theory and the valuation that Marek mentioned between valuation and hedging, but I don't think so. I think that's bad behavior. And I think there are many other aspects of bad behavior having to do with derivatives. So, of course, I'm a quant. I believe that quantitative finance is an important thing, but that may not be, and it will go on as always, but it may not be, of course, the same thing as financial engineering, which is playing with parameters, selling things that shouldn't be sold, and so on.
Okay.
So perhaps the panel would address this point.
Yeah.
What does the panel think about Knight's distinction between risk and uncertainty?
Nice bomb thrown into the middle of the discussion. Right, you sir, you want to comment?
On the specific point of whether attempts to manage risk and sometimes make it worse, there's a couple of examples of that, which I think I would use to point out why that might be the case. In the case of things like exotic derivative modeling, people often produce quite complex mathematical models, run them through big computers and say that gives us a price to within a basis point. Well, actually what they mean is they've solved the equations with that accuracy. It doesn't actually mean that they've got the right answer. And yet they will price with a very small margin very often and risk manage on the basis of the assumptions of that model. And over the course of sometimes quite a long period of time, it comes to light that actually it was the wrong model. A second example is that derivatives used to be quite often known as risk management instruments. And banks, before they decided there would be very good ways of leveraging risk, used to often use them to try to control risk. Now, I would contend that actually if you have complex systems, we have many market participants, and they're all hedging risk using nonlinear instruments with one another. Actually, the behavior of that overall system is actually really very risky in the extreme. And to exemplify that, if you take a very simple case, the example of Lloyd's of London some years ago, there they accidentally ended up reinsuring themselves through cycles of reinsurance. So if you measure the net risk of all of the constituent parts, there was a number, if you looked at the overall risk in reality, it was far greater. And I would argue that in the modern world of derivatives, actually the market as a whole runs the risk of reproducing that problem, but with many more zeros on the end.
Right, well, thanks very much. We had a number of questions and very good points. We'll start again with Dr. Vives.
Okay, so just a few selection of the things. So first, starting on the Greenspan quotation on the collapse of the intellectual edifice of risk management, I think maybe right in one sense. Well, definitely, I think from his perspective, his entire intellectual edifice of what he thought was risk management collapsed completely, because he took many wrong decisions, I would say. But more in terms of the analysis, I would say he's right in the sense that many of the regulations of risk management were geared towards individual risk and not systemic risk. And in this sense, I think he's right. And so what we have to work a lot is on all these aspects on how this translates into systemic risk. Capital regulations, transparency, supervision, etc. Okay, so this is just a basic point, but I think it's worth emphasizing. Second, on the David's question on how to do the intervention, whether these triggers, another run. Well, here, I think it was Mervyn King that wanted to do a covert action, action but could not. But one thing I think that we have learned, but in a sense we knew, and it was not fixed in the UK. I think institutionally it was flawed. In Europe, it's even more messed up, I would say, in general. It's at the time of a crisis, you have to have a crisis is a financial crisis like a war situation. You need a well-defined line of command. And so, what is the well-defined line of command in Europe to face I'm not saying a systemic crisis, but even a crisis of an institution which is kind of pan-European. It's not even now. Now we have all with the La Rosière recommendations created committees and committees, supervising committees, and maybe we'll get something out of that. Maybe. But exactly, lots of jobs. And in the UK, the tripartite system, again, did not quite work. So that's number one. And then once you have this line of command, then you have to decide whether you want to allow some covert action or not. And in any case, you have to act very quickly. And I think this is these are the only possible. And then just a note on something that has been said before on the stress test in the US banks. So your interpretation of the outcome of the stress test and also the future implementation maybe of the public-private investment program of Gidner's, in a sense I think is the positive one, and I hope you are right. But there is another reading which is not so positive, which is basically saying the market interprets that the US banks will get another massive subsidy, and so then therefore all the indicators look better. But they just look better because the taxpayer will pay. So then still, I think there is some tension still on the.
Nice. Dr. Palmer, there's a specific question to you. And
well, I just want to say that it's first worth noting that economists have been thinking in control terms for a long time. I mean, Keynes was thinking in that style even before control theory was created. And there's a Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, and I think the problem is that a control model is only as good as the model you've got for the underlying dynamics. It's not worth thinking about the refinements of exactly how you're going to apply the controls if you don't know what the system's going to do on its own, and you don't know how it's going to respond to the controls when you apply them. And that's really where things have broken down. I think it goes back to the descriptive versus the normative function of economics. It's quite right. I mean, one of the reasons that economics is an exciting science to work on is because there is this possibility for social engineering and for changing the way the world's going to be. But the problem is if your model is so stylized that you don't actually have a good description of how the world is, then your normative prescriptions that come out of that model may just be silly. And despite that, I mean, big actions have been taken on normative prescriptions that were coming out of those kind of silly models. I mean, to go back to your point, I mean, I think there's a big need for humility. You really have to know, it's fine to do these models, but you have to always step back and go, wait a minute, do we really understand enough about it to state with absolute uncertainty, or absolute certainty what we believe? And you know, that's one of the reasons I get nervous when a guy like Larry Summers is running the U.S. economy. He's not known for humility.
Just to follow up on the comment related to models. I think that models are never correct. There is no model that correctly describes what happens in financial markets. I also think that it applies to any other scientific area. We just use models as an approximation of reality, or something that we believe is actually close to. One of the issues that I think is fundamentally important that was mentioned by the chair is that we may, desiring to reduce the risk, actually increase it. And I can see at least two examples, obvious examples of where it can happen and what actually does happen. There is a lot of discussion currently about setting up central clearing counterparty. And there is research by Dara Duffy that seems to indicate that it is not necessarily meant to reduce the risk. It might actually increase it, at least for a period of time. And, well, personally, I'm a strong believer of transparency and importance of the fact that we should probably clear as much as possible through such institutions.
That's if you have, Daryl's thing is if you have specialized clearers, isn't this right?
Now, the point about the whole work is that it becomes more efficient if sufficient number of institutions sign up.
Yeah.
So there is enough of the product underlying that is being cleared and people that come into clearinghouse that actually help. So of course, if you see it this way, you see that the answer is not yes or no in an instant. It might cost us money and risk to put it in place. But once it will become more commonly accepted, it might actually be better. Now, put it in a context of what I just said. The US side would probably not want even accept one universal clearing house for the whole net. Just because implicitly this will be underwritten by the US government. So somehow or other fragmentation is necessary. But still, I think...
Why is fragmentation necessary? There isn't fragmentation in foreign exchange clearing. There's one clearer that was created after the hairstop crisis in '74, owned by the banks, not by the government. But all foreign exchange effectively has a central clearinghouse, and it's one central clearinghouse. I don't understand why competition in clearinghouses is necessarily positive.
But there's no homogeneous
No central. That's the problem of heterogeneity. If you have many different products.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't know how to answer. If it were possible to think of setting up an institution that would be universal clearinghouse for all assets that we trade, okay? So perhaps this should be tied up with this clearinghouse for FX. And if we could bring more assets to it, it would probably be the solution. But oddly enough, the focus of everybody is on clearing CDSs with different conventions all over the planet. There is the SNAC, the new upfront paid contract that has been put in place recently in the United States. Somehow or other is very different to what European Community is trying to do. There is no global coordination, and there is, I think, implicit belief that the government will also have to say too big to fail. Yeah. So if it's too big to fail, it will be bailed out with the money of the taxpayers. So I'm not 100% optimistic on the ability to actually set it out for the global green carbon. And second comment in which I can see that there is a relationship with desire to reduce risk and consequence of concentration of risk somewhere else as a consequence of it, is that when financial institutions offer certain products, there is fashions for what we actually do. They represent opportunities that exist in the market, and this actually corresponds to the following. We get some revenue from sales of these things, and then as a consequence, we take a risk on it. But this risk is concentrated. So on the one hand, it is true that maybe it's not one for one, maybe it's creating systemic risk for financial institutions that all in a certain period of time sell certain types of products, and when things go sour, they become too big to fail, and someone has to bail them out, or someone has to give them money to survive. So that's true that there is this shift between desire to generate return and the concentration of risk that ends up somewhere. It actually sits somewhere.
Actually, I think I've got two general points in this connection. One is that in order to actually understand how you control or reduce risk of any system, you really need to know a lot about it. It just goes beyond just prediction. For example, networks. I mean, we are talking about basically a network. The studies of network shows that sometimes this external force could actually be dominant of a network, but sometimes the internal structure of the network could be the most important thing to look at. I actually had the opportunity when I was talking to people in the Austrian National Bank. They have data of each of their domestic bank, not a clearing, but they know everything about each bank when they trade with each other. They have a matrix of the data every year. And that they try to use it. They realize actually there is no possibility of contagion within their own network, but ever subject to the contagion because it came from outside. So the trouble with it is that you said, I think you're right, global. I mean, I think people haven't really come even near to understanding these networks. So many networks in the world, so many commodities, to be able to basically prescribe how you regulate it. I mean, it seems a bit worried. I mean, I agree with your humility argument here. I think we should be even more humble when we come into thinking about how to regulate the system, if we can't even manage the risk of individual institutions.
But you have to do something.
I know, but sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something.
At least you have to make a decision.
You have to make a decision to learn about. You need actually, if you are in a position of policy making and influence, you should really point out that we need to know more about these things. You need to put more research and more interest, emphasis on learning about networks, different kinds of networks. I'm using the word network in the general sense. Yeah. Now, the second point I was going to make is actually the risk management side. I mean, I'm going back to your point. I think, Mr. Greenspan, God bless him. Everybody loved him when everything was going right. Everybody cursed him. He always got me annoyed because of these quantums. I don't know whether you remember, when there was a 9/11 happened, he brought down the short-term interest rate. I was in hedge fund in Tudor. Brought the short-term interest down with a space of maybe less than a year to 1%. It wasn't now that the interest was low in America. It was 1%. And he kept it at 1% a long time. And he was worrying, why is it the long rate doesn't come down? Because he didn't understand that the 9/11 increased the risk in the world. Didn't reduce the risk, for God's sake. And if you think of the long-term problem, why should the long-term interest rate come down just because you bring the short-term down? And what did it do? It made people create opportunities, create arbitrage, huge arbitrage opportunities, borrowing short and lending long. And we end up where we are. Now, when people do not understand risk at that sort of level, at that level of the epicenter of the risk management of the system, how do you expect everybody else behaving? And nobody said anything. They keep go and search for quantum. See what I mean? I was really amazed at the time.
Just to follow up a little bit, someone has mentioned that we are in the process of building another bubble. Well, we are, because the interest rates are at zero, and the yield curve and the long end shoot up recently. Same thing is happening. And, and the governments build incentives to lend more.
Right. Okay, Bill, this is the last contribution. We have to stop because otherwise you're keeping people from a drink.
Well, I understood.
Right.
But I wanted to respond to the question about Knighting and uncertainty.
Right, please do.
So Knight's book, like his PhD thesis, actually has 3 terms in it: risk, uncertainty, and profit. And Knight's distinction of uncertainty is really rather odd because it's nothing to do with Frank Ramsey or anything like that. It's that business, not financial, business events are too idiosyncratic to be subjected to statistical analysis. And on the other hand, profit is the reward for being able to manage in this uncertain world of idiosyncratic, non-standard, non-uniform circumstances. So on the one hand, the rediscovery of Knight is kind of a useful stick with which to beat humility into quantitative financial practitioners, I would say, more than theorists. But on the other hand, Knight was really talking about a different world. He was talking about Bill Gates rather than Warren Buffett.
Okay, well, I think we've, if one could sum up, or dare to try to sum up, what I think is interesting about this discussion is that we have not reached a conclusion. And that we, in fact, have a large number of issues on the table. There's the whole issue of the day-to-day modeling that somebody working practically in the markets has to do. There are the issues facing policymakers and how policymakers should or should not react. And then we've got to have the discussions of risk and of more, indeed, of global systems and general systems and their relationship to financial variables. And I do think that, and at the end, we've had this notion of humility, and I suppose the humility really derives from the fact that if we had this seminar 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we'd have had lots of disagreements about this and that, but there had been tremendous confidence, I think, that we were making real progress in the quantitative analysis of financial markets. And I think that confidence is less, maybe to put it mildly, less strong today, and that, but it actually makes it much more exciting for academics, of course. Now, our host, David Wallace, wanted to say a word before we wind up.
I do, and thank you very much. John, I wonder if you would allow me, I just wanted to make, before my sort of concluding remarks, just to make 3 simple comments. And they will show how little I know about this subject, but how much I've enjoyed the day. The first was actually, this program originated, in a sense, in a program at the Newton Institute, one of the long programs on quantitative finance, which was 4 or 5 years ago. Just to comment on what you said, and some of the people here were actually involved in that. I really resonated with Doyne's comment about there's no point in trying to model control of a system if you haven't actually got a good underlying model. The comment was made in physical systems, we have good underlying models, but even there, actually, there are lots of things we don't understand. You take turbulence, yeah? It's completely classical. We believe we know the equations, it's Navier-Stokes and such like that, but actually the huge packages which are used by people designing airplanes, etc., are not actually terribly well grounded. Yeah? So even in case, and that's because they're dealing with collective behavior. Even though inanimate collective behavior in turbulence is very difficult to deal with when you're modeling. So how we're going to deal with human collective behavior, that's a big one. Now I'm going to pay for my final comment because of its naivety from David Newbury, who's a colleague in the college. He asked, if we knew in 2004, whenever it was, about Northern Rock, should we have done something? And if my only simple model is truly naive, but if you're in a circumstance and you know a bubble is growing, then the best thing to do is to prick it sooner rather than later, because otherwise you'll get a bigger bang. And if you don't recognize the bubble, you're condemned to boom and bust. And maybe that's an inevitable part of equilibration.
I thought boom and bust had been abolished.
Yeah, well, I haven't to say that it was inevitable. And I kind of believe the economist in it. Okay.
Really, just to close with thank yous, and again to the speakers, the panels, and the chairs. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating, been terrific. I missed a bit of it. Ironically, I had to chair the finance committee of Churchill College. That's a small part of it. The organisers, I never mentioned before, there was a rather loose gathering of people who are here, who have to bring this together. And that was absolutely essential, and I really, really thank them. Without the organisers helping to define and shape this thing, it would never have got off the ground. Also, people who are responsible for support and funding. I want to mention Robert Lees, because we've done these programs on Open for Business in conjunction with the Knowledge Transfer Network, and they've helped to shape an organization's activities. We are long-term research. They are much more focused on practical things. In a great practical partnership for us, actually. Thank you very much. And finally, I must thank John himself, because John is the chair, I guess, of the Cambridge Endowment for Research and Finance, and they, with the Newton Institute, are funding our dinner and other things tonight. So thank you very much, John. Now, this is
It's always good to have a chap called Eat Well funding your dinner.
Forgive me saying it. Finally, I wonder if you could thank staff. I mean, all the staff have been involved, but there are two heroes here. One is Naomi, who's pulled the details together. I don't know if Steve is still in his studio. I invite all of you to have a peek in as you leave. Steve has been in there for whatever it is, 4 hours today, recording our activities. But anyway, I wonder if you join me in a round of applause. Okay, the show must go on, but we're for reception. And then those of us who are staying for dinner tonight up in Churchill College will have to leave about 10 minutes to 7 to walk up there in comfortable time. If anyone would like to come together, we may have 1 or 2 places to come to dinner.